The summer of 1989 in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood was suffocating in more ways than one. The humidity hung thick in the air like a wet blanket, and tensions between the Irish-American families who had called this place home for generations, and the newer arrivals ran just as heavy at the corner of Michigan Avenue and Trumbull, where Tiger Stadium cast its shadow over rows of narrow brick houses. The Morrison family had planted roots that ran deeper than the old oak trees lining their street. James Morrison was 52 that summer, a man whose calloused hands told the story of 3 decades working the line at Ford's River Rouge plant. His wife Catherine, just turned 48, had raised 5 children in their cramped house on Porter Street while taking in sewing to make ends meet. Their oldest son, Patrick, was 26, married with a baby on the way, working construction when he could find it. Sean, 24, had just gotten out of the Marines and was struggling to find his place back in civilian life. The twins, Michael and Daniel, were 19 and fresh out of high school, both working part-time at the local grocery while trying to save money for college. The baby of the family was 15-year-old Bridget, whose bright red hair and fierce green eyes reminded everyone exactly whose daughter she was. The Morrisons weren't wealthy by any stretch, but they were proud. James had bought his son Patrick a used Schwinn bicycle for his 16th birthday back in 1979, a deep blue 10-speed that Patrick had treasured until he outgrew it and passed it down to Sean, who in turn had given it to the twins to share. By the summer of 1989, that bicycle belonged to Bridget and she rode it everywhere. To her job at the ice cream parlor on Michigan Avenue, to visit friends across the neighborhood, to the library on Bagley Street, where she spent hours reading everything she could get her hands on. The East Side Serpents had been creeping into Corktown territory for months. What started as isolated incidents, small-time drug dealing on street corners that had never seen such activity, had gradually escalated into something more organized and territorial. The gang was led by a 28-year-old named Deshaun "Snake" Williams, who had earned his nickname not just for the elaborate tattoo that wound around his left arm, but for his ability to strike quickly and without warning. His lieutenant was Marcus "Heavy" Johnson, a mountain of a man who stood 6'6" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. The rest of their crew was made up of teenagers and young men from Detroit's East Side who saw the Irish neighborhood as easy territory to claim. On the afternoon of July 23, 1989, Bridget Morrison finished her shift at Murphy's Ice Cream at exactly 4:15 p.m. The temperature had climbed to 92 degrees, and the old electric fans in the shop had done little to cut through the oppressive heat. She untied her apron, said goodbye to Mrs. Murphy, and walked outside to where she had chained her bicycle to the lamppost. The chain was there, still locked around the post, but the bicycle was gone. Bridget stood there for a full minute, staring at the empty space where her bike should have been, sweat beading on her forehead as the reality sank in. She looked up and down the street, hoping maybe she had just forgotten where she parked it. But Michigan Avenue stretched out in both directions with no sign of the blue Schwinn. A group of kids from the neighborhood were gathered outside the corner store, and she approached them with hope in her voice. Tommy McGrath, whose family lived 3 houses down from the Morrisons, shook his head when she asked if he had seen anything, but Mrs. Elena Vasquez, who ran the small grocery store and missed nothing that happened on her corner, had seen everything. She told Bridget, in careful, measured words, that 4 young men she didn't recognize had been hanging around for about an hour. They weren't from the neighborhood. She was certain of that. Around 3:30, she had seen them examining the bicycle, and one of them had produced a pair of bolt cutters. They worked quickly and efficiently, cutting through the chain like it was made of paper. The tallest one, wearing a red bandana and a Detroit Pistons jersey, had ridden the bike away while the others followed on foot, heading east toward the bridge. When Bridget walked through the front door of the Porter Street house at 5:20 p.m., her mother Catherine knew immediately that something was wrong. The girl's face was flushed red, and not just from the heat. Catherine was standing at the kitchen sink, cleaning vegetables for dinner, when Bridget's voice cracked as she explained what had happened. The bicycle wasn't just transportation for Bridget. It represented independence, freedom, and her connection to her brothers who had owned it before her. More than that, it was the only valuable thing she possessed in the world. James Morrison arrived home from his shift at the Rouge plant at exactly 6:45 p.m., like he had every weekday for the past 18 years. He parked his 1983 Buick Regal in the narrow driveway and walked through the back door, expecting to smell Catherine's pot roast and hear the usual sounds of his family preparing for dinner. Instead, he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table with their youngest daughter, both of them looking like someone had died. When Catherine explained what had happened, James felt something shift inside his chest, a cold anger that started in his stomach and worked its way up to his throat. The bicycle itself wasn't worth more than $60, maybe $75 on a good day. But it wasn't about the money. In James Morrison's mind, those men hadn't just stolen a piece of property, they had violated something sacred. They had come into his neighborhood, targeted his daughter, and taken something that belonged to his family. More than that, they had made his little girl feel unsafe in the place where she had lived her entire life. Patrick Morrison was installing drywall in a house in Dearborn when his father called him at 7:30 that evening. James rarely called his oldest son at work unless something serious had happened, and Patrick knew from his father's tone that this was one of those times. When James explained the situation, Patrick told his crew he was leaving for the day and drove straight to Porter Street. Sean was already there when Patrick arrived, having walked over from his apartment 6 blocks away. The twins came home together at 8:15, having heard the news from their mother when she called the grocery store. The 5 Morrison men sat around their kitchen table that night, while Catherine served dinner to a family that was too angry to eat. James laid out what they knew, which wasn't much beyond the description Mrs. Vasquez had provided and the direction the thieves had gone. Patrick, who had inherited his father's quick temper, was ready to drive to the east side immediately and start knocking on doors. Sean, trained by the Marines to think tactically, suggested they gather more information before taking any action. The twins, still young enough to see the world in black and white, wanted revenge, plain and simple. At 10:30 p.m., James Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told his sons that they would handle this situation as a family. The police, he said, wouldn't care about one stolen bicycle in a city where murders happened every day. The serpents had chosen to come into Corktown and take what didn't belong to them, and they needed to understand that actions had consequences. James had fought in Vietnam from 1966 to 1968, and he understood violence in ways his sons were only beginning to comprehend. But more than that, he understood that sometimes violence was the only language certain people spoke. The next morning, Sean Morrison began what would become a week-long reconnaissance mission. Using skills he had learned in the Marines, he started mapping the East Side Serpents' territory, identifying their hangouts, and tracking their routines. He discovered that the gang operated primarily out of an abandoned warehouse on Gratiot Avenue, about 4 miles from Corktown. They dealt drugs from street corners in a 6-block radius, and their primary source of income came from selling crack cocaine to suburban kids who drove in from the outlying areas. Sean's investigation revealed that the Serpents had been stealing bicycles throughout the summer, not just from Corktown, but from neighborhoods across southwest Detroit. They would steal the bikes, strip them for parts, and sell the components to a fence who operated out of a pawn shop on 8 Mile Road. It was a small-time operation, but it was systematic and deliberate. They weren't random thieves, they were running a business, By July 30th, Sean had identified 13 active members of the East Side Serpents. Deshaun Williams lived in a second-floor apartment above a party store on Harper Avenue with his girlfriend and her 2-year-old daughter. Marcus Johnson rented a house on Mack Avenue with his mother, who worked the night shift at Detroit Receiving Hospital. The rest of the gang members were younger, mostly between 16 and 22, living with family members or crashing in abandoned buildings throughout the neighborhood. The Morrison family held their second family meeting on the evening of July 31st. This time, they gathered in James's basement workshop, surrounded by his woodworking tools and the smell of sawdust. Sean spread out hand-drawn maps of the East Side on James's workbench and methodically explained what he had learned. He pointed out the Serpents' territory, identified their key locations, and described their daily routines with military precision. Patrick Morrison listened to his younger brother's briefing and felt his anger crystallizing into something colder and more focused. These weren't just kids who had made a mistake. They were criminals who had been systematically victimizing people throughout the city. The theft of Bridget's bicycle was just the latest in a long string of crimes that had gone unpunished. Patrick looked around the basement at his father and brothers and realized they were all thinking the same thing. Michael and Daniel Morrison, the 19-year-old twins, had always been inseparable. They had played on the same baseball teams, dated best friends, and planned to attend Wayne State University together in the fall. They were good kids who had never been in serious trouble, but they were also fiercely protective of their family. When they heard Sean's report about the extent of the Serpents' criminal activities, they felt something shift inside them. This wasn't just about a bicycle anymore. It was about defending their neighborhood and their way of life. James Morrison looked at his 4 sons gathered around his workbench and felt a mixture of pride and dread. These young men were prepared to follow him into whatever came next, and he knew that once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. But he also knew that if they did nothing, the Serpents would interpret their silence as weakness, and the situation would only get worse. On the morning of August 3rd, James Morrison called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Patrick told his construction crew he needed a few days off to deal with a family emergency. Sean had been unemployed since leaving the Marines, so his schedule was his own. The twins requested time off from the grocery store, telling their manager that their grandmother in Grand Rapids was sick and they needed to visit her. The Morrisons spent August 3rd and 4th acquiring weapons and supplies. James owned a .38 caliber revolver that he kept locked in a box in his bedroom closet, a souvenir from his time in Vietnam that he had never fired outside of a shooting range. Patrick borrowed a shotgun from his brother-in-law, who worked security at the Ford plant and never asked questions about why it was needed. Sean still had contacts from his Marine unit, and through a friend of a friend, he acquired 2 additional handguns and several boxes of ammunition. But guns weren't the only tools they prepared. Sean's military training had taught him that successful operations required careful planning and the right equipment. They gathered rope, duct tape, flashlights, and dark clothing. Patrick, who worked construction, provided bolt cutters and crowbars. The twins contributed their knowledge of the city's back roads and shortcuts, having spent years exploring Detroit on their bicycles. The plan they developed was methodical and brutal in its simplicity. They would target the Serpents over a period of several days, working their way up from the youngest members to the leadership. Each operation would be designed to look like a robbery gone wrong or a drug deal that had turned violent. They would scatter the attacks across different parts of the city and vary their methods to avoid establishing a pattern that might attract police attention. On the evening of August 5th, the Morrison family attended Mass at Most Holy Trinity Church, just as they had every Saturday for the past 15 years. Father McKenna delivered a sermon about forgiveness and turning the other cheek, words that seemed to hang in the air with particular weight that evening. After the service, James shook the priest's hand and made small talk about the weather and the Tigers' chances in the pennant race. Catherine lit a candle for her family's safety and said a prayer that she couldn't quite put into words. The first target was Kevin Slim Jackson, a 17-year-old serpent who lived with his grandmother on Russell Street. Sean's surveillance had revealed that Kevin dealt drugs from the corner of Russell and Gratiot every evening from about 9 p.m. until 1 a.m., always working alone and always carrying a significant amount of cash. On the night of August 6th, the twins approached Kevin's corner at 11:30 p.m., walking casually like two young men heading home from a late movie. Michael Morrison struck up a conversation with Kevin about buying marijuana, while Daniel positioned himself behind the young dealer. Kevin was reaching into his pocket to show his product when Daniel wrapped an arm around his throat and Michael pressed a knife to his ribs. They dragged him into the alley behind an abandoned building where Patrick and Sean were waiting with a stolen car. What happened in that alley took less than 10 minutes, but it established a pattern that would repeat 12 more times over the next 8 days. Kevin Jackson died from a combination of stab wounds and blunt force trauma, his body found the next morning by a homeless man looking for bottles. The police investigation that followed was perfunctory at best. Kevin was a known drug dealer in a neighborhood where violence was common, and his murder was filed away as just another casualty of the drug trade. The second victim was Raymond Little Ray Davis, 19 years old, who worked as a lookout for the Serpent's crack house on Mack Avenue. Patrick and Sean grabbed him as he walked home from work at 2 a.m. on August 8th, pulling him into the back seat of their car and driving to an abandoned lot in Highland Park. Raymond's death was quicker than Kevin's, but no less violent. They left his body in a dumpster behind a closed gas station, where it wouldn't be found until the following afternoon. By August 10th, 3 more serpents were dead, and the surviving members were beginning to panic. Deshaun Williams called a meeting in the warehouse on Gratiot Avenue, demanding to know if anyone had information about what was happening to his crew. The remaining gang members looked at each other with suspicion and fear, wondering who would be next and whether one of their own had turned against them. Marcus Johnson suggested that a rival gang was moving in on their territory, trying to eliminate the serpents so they could take over the drug trade in the area. Deshaun wasn't convinced. The murders were too random, too spread out across the city to be the work of an organized crew trying to claim territory. This felt personal, like someone had a specific grudge against the serpents, but he couldn't figure out who or why. The Morrison family continued their methodical campaign throughout the second week of August. James had taken vacation time from the Ford plant, telling his supervisor he was planning to do some work on his house. Catherine noticed that her husband and sons were acting strangely, staying out late and speaking in hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered the room, but she didn't ask questions, sensing that whatever they were involved in was something she was better off not knowing. On August 12th, they killed 2 serpents in one night. First was Anthony Ant Williams, Deshaun's 19-year-old cousin, who was shot 3 times in the chest as he walked to his car after visiting his girlfriend. 2 hours later, they cornered Jerome J. Rock Patterson in the bathroom of a 24-hour diner on Warren Avenue, strangling him with a length of rope and leaving his body in a locked stall where it wouldn't be discovered until the next morning. The Detroit Police Department's Homicide Division was overwhelmed that summer with a record number of murders, most of them drug-related. Detective Sarah O'Malley, a 20-year veteran who had grown up just 10 blocks from where the serpent murders were taking place, was assigned to investigate the growing number of dead gang members. But with limited resources and dozens of other cases demanding her attention, she could only dedicate a few hours each week to tracking down leads that consistently went nowhere. By August 15th, 8 members of the East Side Serpents were dead, and the remaining 5 were in hiding. Deshaun Williams had moved out of his apartment and was sleeping in different locations every night, never staying anywhere long enough for potential enemies to track him down. Marcus Johnson had convinced his mother to visit her sister in Chicago until things cooled down, and he was considering following her there permanently. The Morrison family held their final planning meeting on the evening of August 16th. James spread Sean's maps across the kitchen table after Catherine had gone to bed, and the 5 men discussed how to finish what they had started. The remaining serpents were harder to find now, more cautious about their movements and less predictable in their routines. But Sean had been watching the warehouse on Gratiot Avenue, and he knew that Deshaun Williams would eventually have to surface to maintain control of what was left of his organization. On the night of August 17th, all 5 Morrison men positioned themselves around the Serpent's warehouse. Sean and the twins took positions in abandoned buildings across the street, while James and Patrick waited in a stolen van 2 blocks away. At 9:30 p.m., Deshaun Williams arrived at the warehouse driving a stolen Cadillac, followed by Marcus Johnson in a rusted Buick. 3 other serpents came on foot from different directions, the last survivors of what had once been a 13-man crew. The final confrontation lasted 26 minutes and was more violent than anything the Morrisons had done before. They had cornered all 5 remaining serpents in the warehouse, and what followed was less like the calculated executions of the previous 2 weeks and more like a war. Deshaun Williams managed to fire 6 shots from a .45 automatic before Sean Morrison put 2 bullets in his chest. Marcus Johnson knocked Michael Morrison unconscious with a metal pipe and was preparing to finish him off when Patrick shot him in the head with his borrowed shotgun. When the violence was over, all 5 remaining members of the East Side Serpents were dead, scattered across the concrete floor of the warehouse like broken toys. Michael Morrison had a concussion and 3 broken ribs where Marcus Johnson had beaten him with the pipe. Daniel Morrison had been grazed by one of Deshaun's bullets, the slug carving a shallow furrow across his left shoulder blade. But all 5 Morrisons were alive, and their 2-week campaign of revenge was finally complete. They burned the warehouse to the ground using gasoline Patrick had brought in jerry cans, ensuring that any physical evidence of their presence would be destroyed. The building was completely engulfed by the time they drove away, lighting up the night sky with flames that could be seen for miles. The Detroit Fire Department responded within 12 minutes, but by then, the structure had collapsed into a pile of smoking rubble that would burn for 3 more hours. Detective Sarah O'Malley arrived at the scene of the warehouse fire at 2:15 a.m. on August 18th, summoned by a fire department captain who had discovered multiple bodies in the wreckage. What she found were the charred remains of 5 young men, 4 of whom she recognized from previous investigations into the East Side Serpents. Even with the damage from the fire, it was clear that all 5 had died from gunshot wounds before the building started burning. Standing in the ashes of what had been the Serpents' headquarters, Detective O'Malley realized she was looking at the conclusion of the most systematic elimination of a criminal organization she had ever seen. In 13 days, someone had methodically hunted down and killed every single member of the East Side Serpents. The murders had been carried out with military precision, each one designed to look like a random act of violence while actually being part of a larger, coordinated campaign. The investigation that followed would consume the next 3 years of Detective O'Malley's career and ultimately end in frustration. Despite hundreds of interviews, thousands of hours of investigation, and cooperation from multiple law enforcement agencies, she was never able to identify who had been responsible for the Serpent murders. The few witnesses she found had seen nothing useful, and the physical evidence had been either destroyed in the warehouse fire or was too contaminated by the urban environment to provide meaningful leads. James Morrison returned to work at the Ford plant on August 19th, telling his supervisor that his vacation had been relaxing and that he was ready to get back to his normal routine. Patrick resumed his construction job, Sean continued looking for work, and the twins prepared to start their freshman year at Wayne State University in 3 weeks. To their neighbors and friends, the Morrison family seemed exactly the same as they had always been. But Catherine Morrison knew that something fundamental had changed in her family during those 2 weeks in August. Her husband had developed a nervous habit of checking the locks on all the doors and windows before going to bed each night. Her sons jumped at unexpected sounds and avoided making eye contact with police officers when they encountered them on the street. The easy camaraderie that had always existed between her boys had been replaced by a tense, watchful silence. In September 1989, Bridget Morrison started her sophomore year at Southwestern High School. Her mother had bought her a new bicycle to replace the one that had been stolen, a red 10-speed that Bridget rode to school every day. But she never left it unattended for more than a few minutes, and she always chose well-lit, heavily trafficked areas when she had to lock it up. The theft that had started everything seemed almost insignificant now, a minor incident that had somehow mushroomed into something much larger and more terrible. The neighborhood around Porter Street was quieter that fall than it had been in months. The drug dealing that had been creeping into Corktown during the summer had disappeared completely, and families felt safer letting their children play outside after dark. Mrs. Elena Vasquez noticed that the young men who had been hanging around her corner store were gone, replaced by the familiar faces of neighborhood kids who had lived there all their lives. Detective Sarah O'Malley never officially closed the Serpent murder cases, but after 3 years of investigation, she moved on to other priorities. In quiet moments, usually late at night when she was working alone in the homicide office, she would pull out the files and study the crime scene photos, looking for some detail she might have missed. She was certain that the murders had been carried out by someone with military or police training, someone who understood how to kill efficiently and avoid leaving evidence. But Detroit in 1989 was full of veterans and ex-cops, and without more specific leads, she had no way to narrow down the list of potential suspects. The Morrison family never spoke about what happened during those 2 weeks in August, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone outside their immediate family. It was as if they had collectively agreed to pretend that period of time had never existed, that they had spent those days doing exactly what they had told their employers and friends they were doing. But the silence wasn't complete. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, one of them would find another sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the empty street. Patrick Morrison's wife gave birth to their first child in October 1989, a son they named James after his grandfather. Patrick held his newborn son in the hospital room and felt the weight of what he had done settle over him like a physical presence. He wondered what kind of world he had helped create for his child, whether the violence he had participated in had made their neighborhood safer or simply replaced one form of danger with another. Sean Morrison found steady work in November 1989 with a private security company that provided guards for office buildings and shopping centers. The job was routine and boring, exactly what he needed after the intensity of his military service and the events of the previous summer. He worked the night shift, walking empty hallways and checking locked doors, trying not to think about the skills he had used to track and kill 13 young men over the course of 2 weeks. Michael and Daniel Morrison began their college careers at Wayne State University in September 1989, majoring in business and engineering respectively. They lived in a dormitory in downtown Detroit, coming home to Porter Street only on weekends and holidays. Their classmates knew them as serious, quiet young men who studied hard and avoided the parties and social events that occupied most freshmen. The twins remained as close as they had always been, but their conversations now carried an undercurrent of shared experience that no one else could understand. James Morrison continued working at the Ford plant for 6 more years, retiring in 1995 with a pension and 38 years of service. He used his retirement to work on projects around the house, building furniture in his basement workshop and tending a small garden in his backyard. Neighbors who had known him for decades commented that he seemed more withdrawn in his later years, less likely to engage in the casual conversations that had once made him a popular figure in the neighborhood. Catherine Morrison developed insomnia in the months following August 1989, lying awake at night listening to the sounds of her house settling and her family sleeping. She began attending daily Mass at Most Holy Trinity, not just on Saturdays, and spent long hours in prayer, asking for forgiveness for sins she couldn't bring herself to name specifically. She never asked her husband or sons directly about what they had done, but she lit candles for 13 young men whose names she had read in the newspaper. Detective Sarah O'Malley retired from the Detroit Police Department in 2004 after 35 years of service. The Serpent murders remained the most frustrating unsolved case of her career, a puzzle she had never been able to solve despite years of investigation. In her final report, she wrote that she believed the murders had been carried out by a small, disciplined group with both the motivation and skills necessary to eliminate an entire criminal organization. But she acknowledged that without new evidence or witnesses, the case would likely remain unsolved indefinitely. The abandoned warehouse on Gratiot Avenue was never rebuilt after the fire. The lot remained vacant for years, gradually filling with weeds and debris until the city finally cleaned it up and turned it into a small park in 1997. Local residents sometimes used the park for picnics and informal gatherings, but most people avoided it after dark, sensing something unsettling about the place, even if they didn't know its history. Bridget Morrison graduated from high school in 1992 and received a full scholarship to study journalism at the University of Michigan. She moved to Ann Arbor and rarely came home to visit. Finding excuses to stay on campus during holidays and summer breaks, she became an investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press after graduation, specializing in crime stories and police corruption. Her colleagues knew her as a fearless journalist who could get sources to talk about sensitive subjects, but she never wrote about the events that had shaped her own family's history. The red bicycle that Catherine Morrison had bought to replace the stolen blue Schwinn sat unused in the garage on Porter Street for years. Bridget had outgrown it by the time she left for college, and none of the Morrison family members seemed interested in riding it. James occasionally moved it when he needed to access his tools, but otherwise it remained exactly where Catherine had placed it in 1989. A reminder of how a simple theft had set in motion events that changed everything. In 1999, exactly 10 years after the Serpent murders, the Detroit Free Press published a retrospective article about unsolved crimes from the 1980s. The article devoted 3 paragraphs to the systematic elimination of the East Side Serpents, describing it as one of the most thorough and mysterious gang killings in the city's history. The reporter noted that despite extensive investigation, police had never developed any solid leads in the case, and the murders remained as puzzling in 1999 as they had been in 1989. Patrick Morrison read the newspaper article while eating breakfast in his kitchen on Verner Street, just 6 blocks from where he had grown up. He was 36 years old now, married with 3 children, working as a foreman for the same construction company where he had been a laborer 10 years earlier. His hands still bore the calluses of physical labor, but his face showed the lines of a man who had seen more than his share of violence. He folded the newspaper carefully and threw it in the trash without mentioning the article to his wife. Sean Morrison had moved to Phoenix, Arizona in 1995, taking a job with a security firm that specialized in protecting corporate executives and wealthy individuals. The desert climate agreed with him, and the work allowed him to use his military training in a legal and productive way. He married a nurse named Jennifer in 1997, and they had 2 daughters who knew their father only as a quiet, careful man who never talked about his time in Detroit or his service in the Marines. The twins, Michael and Daniel Morrison, both graduated from Wayne State University in 1993 and found jobs in Detroit's recovering automotive industry. Michael became an accountant for a parts supplier, while Daniel worked as an engineer for one of the major manufacturers. They both married women from their college classes, bought houses in the suburbs, and started families of their own. They remained close, getting together for barbecues and holiday celebrations, but they never spoke about the summer of 1989, even when they were alone together. James Morrison died of a heart attack in 2003, at the age of 66. He was working in his basement workshop when it happened, sanding a rocking chair he was building for his newest grandchild. Catherine found him there 3 hours later when she came down to call him for dinner. His funeral was held at Most Holy Trinity Church, and the entire Corktown neighborhood turned out to pay their respects to a man they remembered as a devoted father and hard-working neighbor. At the funeral, Detective Sarah O'Malley, now retired for several years, sat in the back pew and watched the Morrison family grieve their patriarch. Something about the family had always nagged at her during her investigation of the Serpent murders, some instinct that told her they were connected to the case in ways she couldn't prove. But as she watched James Morrison's sons carry his casket out of the church, she realized she would never know the truth about what had happened in August 1989. Catherine Morrison sold the house on Porter Street in 2005 and moved to a senior living community in Dearborn. She lived quietly there for 8 years, attending daily mass and spending time with her grandchildren when they visited. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2013, at the age of 72, taking whatever knowledge she had about her family's secrets to her grave. Her children found a rosary in her nightstand drawer with 13 extra beads that had been added to the traditional design, each one representing prayers she had said for souls she believed needed extra intercession. The Porter Street house was bought by a young family from Mexico who had immigrated to Detroit to work in the automotive industry. They painted the exterior bright yellow and planted a garden in the backyard where Catherine Morrison's roses had once grown. The new owners knew nothing about the history of their home or the family who had lived there for 30 years. To them, it was simply a solid, well-built house in a quiet neighborhood where they could raise their children safely. Bridget Morrison became a successful investigative journalist, winning several awards for her reporting on corruption and organized crime in Detroit. She married a fellow reporter in 2001 and moved to Chicago, where she continued her career with the Tribune. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and made sure they grew up knowing their grandparents had been good, hard-working people who had loved their family deeply. She never told them about the bicycle that had been stolen or about what had happened afterward. In 2014, 25 years after the Serpent murders, a developer purchased the vacant lot where the warehouse had burned and announced plans to build affordable housing for senior citizens. During the groundbreaking ceremony, construction workers unearthed several pieces of melted metal that had once been bicycles, apparently stored in the warehouse when it burned. The discovery made a brief mention in the local news, described as evidence of the building's former use as a chop shop for stolen goods. Patrick Morrison, now in his 50s and working as a building inspector for the city of Detroit, read about the discovery online and felt something twist in his stomach. He realized that among those melted frames and wheels might be the remains of his sister's blue Schwinn, the bicycle that had started everything. He drove to the construction site that evening and stood at the chain-link fence, looking at the pile of excavated debris and wondering if any part of their family's story was buried in that twisted metal. Sean Morrison learned about his father's death through a phone call from Patrick, but he didn't return to Detroit for the funeral. He told his family in Phoenix that he had work commitments he couldn't break. But the truth was that he couldn't bring himself to face the place where he had spent 2 weeks systematically hunting and killing 13 people. He sent flowers and a sympathy card and made a donation to Most Holy Trinity Church in his father's memory, but he never set foot in Michigan again. The twins, now in their 40s with children of their own, maintained successful careers and comfortable lives in suburban Detroit. Michael had become a partner in his accounting firm, while Daniel had been promoted to chief engineer at his company. Their families spent holidays together, and their children grew up thinking of each other as siblings rather than cousins. But sometimes, when they were watching their kids play in the backyard or ride bicycles around the neighborhood, one of the twins would catch the other's eye, and they would both look away quickly, remembering what they had done to protect their family's honor. Detective Sarah O'Malley died in 2018 at the age of 74, having never solved the case that had haunted her for 3 decades. Her daughter found boxes of files in her basement after the funeral, meticulously organized reports and photographs documenting every aspect of the Serpent murders. Among the papers was a handwritten note that said simply, "The Morrison family knows something. I can feel it, but I can't prove it, and maybe that's for the best." The last surviving witness to the bicycle theft, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, passed away in 2019 at the age of 89. She had continued operating her small grocery store until 2015, when age and declining health forced her to sell the business to her nephew. In her final years, she occasionally told the story of the young red-haired girl whose bicycle had been stolen, and how that simple crime had somehow led to the disappearance of the gang members who had been terrorizing the neighborhood. She never made the connection explicitly, but she always ended the story by noting that sometimes justice came in ways the law couldn't provide. Today, the Corktown neighborhood, where the Morrison family once lived, has been transformed by gentrification and urban renewal. Young professionals have moved into renovated houses that once belonged to working-class families, and trendy restaurants have replaced the corner stores and family-owned businesses that served the community for generations. The new residents know nothing about the history of their neighborhood, about the gang that once tried to claim it as territory, or about the family that eliminated 13 people to protect what they considered theirs. Bridget Morrison, now in her 40s and working as a senior editor at a major Chicago newspaper, occasionally assigns reporters to cover cold cases and unsolved crimes in Detroit. She has never suggested that anyone investigate the Serpent murders, and she avoids reading articles about gang violence from that era. She has built a successful career exposing corruption and seeking justice for victims. But she has never been able to reconcile her professional commitment to truth with her family's decision to take justice into their own hands. The blue Schwinn bicycle that started everything was never recovered, its fate lost in the chaos of August 1989. Perhaps it was stripped for parts and sold, as Sean Morrison's investigation had suggested the Serpents did with stolen bikes. Perhaps it was abandoned somewhere and eventually hauled away as junk, or perhaps it was destroyed in the warehouse fire along with the men who stole it, reduced to the same twisted metal that construction workers would unearth 25 years later. Patrick Morrison still lives in Detroit, though he has moved several times over the years as the city changed around him. He is now 58 years old, a grandfather who teaches his grandchildren to ride bicycles in the park where the Serpent's warehouse once stood. The irony is not lost on him. watching these innocent children learn to balance and pedal on the same ground where he once participated in acts of terrible violence. But he has never told them that story, and he never will. The Morrison family's secret has remained buried for more than 30 years now, carried only by the surviving members who have built new lives on the foundation of what they did in August 1989. They have become respectable citizens, devoted parents, and productive members of society. But each of them carries the knowledge of 13 deaths, 13 families that were destroyed because someone had stolen a 15-year-old girl's bicycle. In the end, the question that haunts the Morrison family is not whether they were justified in their actions, but whether the price they paid for their revenge was worth the cost. They eliminated a criminal organization and made their neighborhood safer, but they also crossed a line that transformed them from victims into something else entirely. They protected their family's honor and sent a message that their community would not tolerate being victimized, but they did so by becoming the very thing they claimed to be fighting against. The stolen bicycle that started it all has become a symbol in the minds of those who remember, representing the thin line between justice and vengeance, between protecting what you love and destroying what threatens it. In a city where violence was common and justice was often elusive, the Morrison family chose to write their own ending to a story that began with a simple theft. Whether that ending was right or wrong depends on perspective, but its consequences continue to ripple through the lives of everyone who was touched by those 2 weeks in August 1989. The 13 members of the East Side Serpents died as they had lived, violently and without ceremony. Their families mourned them, their friends remembered them, and their enemies celebrated their deaths. But in the larger context of Detroit's history, they became just another set of statistics in a city that had seen too much violence and lost too many young men to the streets. The Morrison family ensured that their story would end quickly and completely, leaving no loose ends and no survivors to seek revenge. Today, if you walk through the Corktown neighborhood where this story began, you will find no trace of the events that unfolded in the summer of 1989. The houses have been renovated, the businesses have changed hands, and the people have moved on. But sometimes, late at night when the streets are quiet, you might catch a glimpse of the past in the shadows between the streetlights. A reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide secrets that are too dark to speak aloud.